In the lively city of Oboli, where bright lights and busy streets carried the stories of the rich and the poor, Ifunanya stepped into a new life. She had always been a woman of grace, the kind of beauty that wasn't just about her face but the way she carried herself, calm, confident, and full of dreams that went beyond limits. When she married Darlington, the powerful CEO of a logistics empire, the whole city talked about it. Some admired her elegance, her ability to stand tall beside a man of such influence. But many others whispered cruelly behind her back. They said she was nothing more than a gold digger, a village girl who was lucky enough to catch a rich man. At parties and gatherings their eyes followed her, their mouths full of judgment she could not escape. But Ifunanya, wrapped in her vibrant ankara and beads that reflected her heritage, never let those whispers break her poise. Inside, she dreamed of building her own path, not just being known as the wife of Darlington. Yet, the world around her refused to see that light, and their voices grew louder, shaping the beginning of a story no one could have predicted. Every gathering became a stage where Ifunanya's dignity was tested. Whenever Darlington's relatives saw her, their smiles were sharp, like knives hidden behind silk. They would whisper just loud enough for her to hear, calling her lucky, saying she had nothing before marrying their son, their brother, their cousin. Sometimes they didn't even bother to hide it. "She's just a gold digger," one aunt muttered at a wedding, her eyes sweeping over Ifunanya like she was unworthy of the chair she sat on. Laughter would follow, sly and bitter, as though mocking her was a form of entertainment. What broke her the most wasn't their words, it was Darlington's silence. He never stood up for her, never once told them to stop. Instead, he sipped his drink, adjusted his suit, and pretended not to hear. To Ifunanya, that silence was louder than their insults. It told her where she stood in his heart, and it wasn't where a wife should stand. She would smile through the humiliation, holding her glass of palm wine or sparkling champagne with steady hands, though her heart was bleeding. Inside she asked herself, is this what marriage is meant to feel like? A woman fighting alone while her husband watches? There were nights she returned home, her makeup still perfect but her pillow soaked in tears. She replayed every mocking laugh in her head until it felt like a chorus haunting her dreams. But in public she refused to let them see her break. She carried herself like royalty, dressed in bold African prints, her head tied in geli that kissed the sky, her footsteps firm. They wanted to shame her, but she knew deep down that their hatred came from envy. Still, the words gold digger clung to her name like a shadow she could not escape, and the silence of her husband made it heavier than ever. The gala was meant to be a night of glamour, a celebration of wealth and power where the most influential people of Oboli gathered under chandeliers that sparkled like fallen stars. Ifunanya arrived beside Darlington, dressed in a gown that shimmered in the light, her geli tied high, her jewelry subtle but elegant. She walked into the hall with grace, determined to blend into the world her husband belonged to. But as the music played and glasses clinked, the whispers began again, sharper this time, like arrows piercing her pride. Darlington's friends circled him with laughter, and soon the jokes turned toward her. "She must have been very lucky," one of them said, his eyes on her as though she were a prize he could mock. Another chuckled, adding, "From the stories I've heard, she came from nothing. Can you imagine? A village girl now walking red carpets." The group erupted in laughter, the sound echoing across the room, louder than the music. They didn't care that she stood right there, close enough to hear every word. In fact, some looked straight at her when they said it, as though daring her to break. Darlington didn't defend her. He laughed along, clinking his glass with theirs, as if mocking his own wife was a sport. For Ifunanya, that laughter was a blade to the heart. Her eyes burned with tears, but she refused to let them fall. She lifted her chin slightly, forcing a small smile that masked her pain. Inside, her pride bled. She wanted to scream, to tell them who she really was, to remind them she was more than their shallow judgments. But the hall was full of eyes, and her silence became her shield. As the night went on, she danced, smiled, and carried herself like the queen she knew she was. But her heart was in pieces. The humiliation was heavy, not because of what they said, but because the man who promised to love her stood there and let them destroy her dignity. That night, she learned that silence could betray louder than words. Ifunanya refused to let the cruelty of others define her. Even when the words gold digger followed her into every room, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that made people stop and stare. She had a way of turning pain into poise, of turning shame into strength. While others hid behind designer clothes that shouted for attention, she chose Ankara prints that told stories of her roots, Isiagu patterns that spoke of tradition and pride. Her style was a reminder that no matter where she was standing, in a ballroom or at a family gathering, she had not forgotten who she was. People admired her. Women whispered about her elegance. Men praised her composure, and strangers often looked at her with awe. But admiration did not stop the cutting tongues. Behind those compliments were the same whispers, sharp and cruel, mocking her background, doubting her intentions, painting her as a woman who came only for Darlington's wealth. Every smile she wore in public was stitched together with strength. Every step she took in her high heels was heavy with battles she fought inside her heart. She heard the mocking laughter, the sly comments, the sarcastic greetings, yet she answered with nothing but grace. It was not that she didn't feel the sting. She felt it deeply. At night, when the lights went out and the house grew quiet, she lay in bed replaying those words until they cut like glass. But by morning she rose again, wrapping her head tie-high, putting on her bold patterns, and stepping out into the world like a woman untouched. To many she seemed unshakable, a woman with an unbreakable spirit. But inside she carried wounds that no one could see. Still she endured because she knew that if she let them see her break, they would win. She chose dignity over anger, silence over shouting, poise over pain. And though the world mocked her, deep down she believed that one day, life itself would speak for her in a way no human voice could silence. Behind the polished smiles and picture-perfect appearances, the truth of Ifunanya's marriage was bitter. Behind the doors of their mansion, where love was supposed to live, Darlington grew colder with each passing day. He no longer looked at her with the tenderness of a husband. Instead, his eyes carried distance, as if she were just another accessory to his life. To him she became a trophy, something to display in public, to dress up for parties, to walk beside him like proof of status. But when the crowd was gone, so was his affection. Conversations that once had laughter now ended in silence. Meals together turned into long evenings where he scrolled through his phone, ignoring her presence. When she tried to speak, he dismissed her with a wave of his hand or a careless, "Not now." Slowly, the walls of their home began to feel like a prison, trapping her in a marriage that looked perfect from the outside but was breaking her spirit inside. The betrayal wasn't loud. He didn't shout at her, he didn't raise his hand. He did something worse. He withdrew his love. He treated her as though her feelings didn't matter, as if her only value was how she looked standing next to him. For Ifunanya, that silence cut deeper than any harsh word. She realized she was married to a man who cared about the world's opinion more than the heart of the woman who shared his bed. At night she would stare at the ceiling, asking herself, "Is this what I left my dreams for? Is this what it means to be a wife?" She thought marriage was meant to be a home, a place of safety and love, but hers had become a cage, golden, polished, and admired by others, but cold and empty inside. Her heart ached, but something inside her was changing. The silence that once broke her was slowly hardening her. She began to understand that she could no longer depend on him for happiness. The betrayal of love had opened her eyes, and though she still stayed, she started to carry a strength he could not see. Strength. The night at Mbanizi Villa was supposed to be warm and full of family. The long dining table glittered with silver cutlery, steaming plates of jollof rice, roasted goat meat, pepper soup, and wine that flowed endlessly. Laughter filled the air, but for Ifunanya, it was the kind of laughter that cut straight into her soul. She sat quietly beside Darlington, trying to smile, trying to belong, but the whispers began again. This time they weren't even whispers, they were bold. One cousin leaned across the table and said loudly, "If not for my brother's money, would you even be here today?" Another chimed in, "We all know she came from nothing. She should be grateful he picked her." The table erupted in mocking laughter. Ifunanya's hands trembled slightly as she held her fork, but she kept her head high. She thought at least Darlington would say something. At least tonight, in front of his family, he would defend his wife. But instead, Darlington leaned back in his chair, smirked, and joined their laughter. His voice was the one that broke her heart the most. "Well, isn't that why you married me?" he said, almost proudly, as if exposing her in front of everyone was a joke worth sharing. The room echoed with cruel laughter, but Ifunanya could no longer hear it. Her ears buzzed, her chest tightened, and for a moment, It felt like the ground beneath her had disappeared. She forced a faint smile, but inside, her heart shattered into pieces she could never gather back. She excused herself from the table, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor as she walked away. No one followed her. Not even her husband. That night, staring at herself in the mirror, she saw more than a woman humiliated. She saw a woman awakening. The dinner had burned away the last illusion she held. She realized the man she married would never stand for her. And in that painful truth, something inside her shifted. It was the night her heart broke, but it was also the night her strength began to. The nights after the cruel dinner felt endless. Ifeanyi would lie in her wide, luxurious bed, staring at the ceiling while the silence of the mansion pressed down on her. By day, she wore her calm smile like armor, but at night, the weight of everything she had endured came crashing down. She buried her face in her pillow, letting the tears flow quietly, careful not to let anyone hear. The pain was heavy, not just because of the insults from his family, but because of Darlington's betrayal. The man who should have defended her had been the one to wound her the deepest. Every word replayed in her mind like an echo. "Isn't that why you married me?" That sentence cut into her chest again and again. She cried until her eyes ached, but the more the tears came, the more something began to change inside her. Slowly, the pain began to turn into something else, something stronger. She realized she had begged for respect without even knowing it. She had hoped he would fight for her. She had prayed his silence would break. But now she knew. She could not keep waiting for him to give her the dignity she deserved. One night, sitting on the edge of her bed with the moonlight washing over her face, she whispered to herself, "No more." Her voice was shaky but determined. She promised herself that she would never again beg to be valued. If respect would not come from her husband or his family, she would create her own. She would rise, even if she had to rise alone. It was a quiet moment, but it was powerful, the birth of her strength. The same tears that once felt like weakness had watered something deep inside her, courage. From that night, the sleepless hours no longer broke her. They became her training ground. She was no longer just a woman crying in silence. She was a woman preparing to rewrite her story. Weeks passed and Ifeanyi carried her pain quietly, moving through the mansion like a shadow no one noticed. Then one bright afternoon the doorbell rang, and a man in a black suit stepped inside, holding a leather briefcase. He introduced himself as a lawyer, asking specifically for Ifeanyi. Darlington raised his brow in confusion but said nothing, assuming it was a minor issue. Ifeanyi's hands trembled slightly as she led the lawyer to the sitting room, her heart pounding with questions she couldn't yet answer. The lawyer placed a thick envelope on the table, his voice calm but firm. "Madam Ifeanyi," he said, "before your father passed away, he made investments under your name. They have matured over the years. You are now one of the major shareholders in Damasco Logistics." The words hit her like thunder. She blinked, not sure she had heard correctly. Her late father, quiet, wise, and humble, had left her not just memories but wealth, hidden away until the right time. Darlington froze in his chair. He laughed at first as if it were a joke, but when the lawyer slid the documents across the table, stamped and sealed, the truth became undeniable. Ifeanyi held the papers in her hands, her heart racing as she read through the figures, the shares, the authority she now carried. This was not small money. This was power. She felt a shiver run through her body, not from fear but from awakening. The same people who mocked her for coming from nothing had no idea she had something greater than they could ever imagine. She was no longer just Darlington's wife. She was a woman who now owned part of the very empire they thought she was unworthy to stand beside. That day, something shifted forever. Ifeanyi realized her father had seen her worth long before anyone else had, and his foresight had given her a gift no insult could take away. She looked across at Darlington, who sat speechless, his pride cracking in silence. For the first time in a long while she felt. Ifeanyi's life began to take a different shape. While Darlington still walked around with pride, pretending nothing had changed, she quietly started showing up in places no one expected her to be. One morning, dressed in a deep blue Ankara gown with golden embroidery, she walked into the boardroom of Damasco Logistics. The men seated around the long polished table turned their heads in surprise. They had only ever seen her at parties, standing beside Darlington like decoration. But now she wasn't there as a wife, she was there as a shareholder. The documents her father left her had made her one of the largest owners of the company, and her presence could not be ignored. Some whispered among themselves, shocked to see her there, but no one could laugh. Her elegance and confidence filled the room before she even spoke. She sat upright, her gele tied proudly, her eyes calm yet sharp, and when the discussions began she listened carefully, taking notes, asking questions. Slowly she proved she wasn't just a woman with shares on paper. She was a woman who understood vision and strategy. Every meeting was a test, but Ifunanya passed them all with quiet strength. The men who once mocked her at parties now adjusted their ties when she walked in. Even those who doubted her could not deny the weight of her voice. Respect, the very thing she had once begged for in silence, now followed her naturally. She didn't need to demand it. It came to her because she had earned it. Darlington watched with unease. The same wife he used to laugh at had now become his equal in the company he built. And though he tried to hide his discomfort behind forced smiles, Ifunanya saw it clearly. She didn't rub it in his face. She didn't boast. She simply showed up, day after day, commanding the respect that had once been denied her. In those meetings, Ifunanya felt something new rising inside her, freedom. For the first time, she wasn't sitting in a corner waiting to be noticed. She was seated at. The company's annual event was held in a grand hall glittering with chandeliers, and filled with the who's who of Obelik's business world. Darlington walked in proudly, his arm draped over Ifunanya's shoulder as though she were nothing more than an ornament. She wore a rich wine-colored lace gown, her gele tall and bold, her presence radiant. Yet despite her elegance, the mocking eyes found her again. Darlington's friends, the same ones who had laughed at her at the gala, gathered near the bar, whispering and smirking. One of them said just loud enough, "Look at her, still clinging to his arm. Without him, she's nothing." Another laughed, adding, "She should thank her stars every day. A village girl sitting among kings." Their words cut like before, but this time Ifunanya felt no sting. Instead she felt fire. As the speeches began and glasses clinked, she rose from her seat. The hall grew quiet, surprised to see her standing. Her voice was calm, steady, but it carried across the room like a drumbeat. "For so long I have been called a gold digger," she began, her eyes sweeping over the crowd. "For so long, people thought I had nothing but his name to my own. But let me tell you something tonight." She paused, her lips curving into the faintest smile. "I am not just his wife. I own part of this company." The room froze. Forks dropped against plates. Conversations died mid-sentence. Jaws literally fell open as her words settled into the air like thunder. Even Darlington's face went pale, the proud mask slipping for the first time. Ifunanya stood tall, her gown glittering under the lights, her head high with dignity. No one laughed this time. No one dared. The very people who mocked her now looked at her with wide eyes, their arrogance dissolving into silence. She didn't shout, she didn't boast. She simply spoke her truth, and it was enough to silence an entire hall. That night, the name Ifunanya was no longer spoken with mockery. It was spoken with awe. Darlington had always believed he held all the power. In his mind, Ifunanya was nothing without him, a woman who should be grateful for the life he had given her. But that night, as her words echoed across the grand hall, his world cracked. "I own part of this company." The sentence hit him harder than any blow could. He turned pale, his glass trembling in his hand as the room erupted in shocked whispers. For the first time, Darlington truly saw her, not as the quiet, graceful woman who stood beside him, but as an equal. And worse, not an equal because of him, but in spite of him. She had gained her power not through his wealth or his name, but through her own father's foresight and her own strength. His pride, the same pride he had carried like a crown, slipped from his head and shattered on the marble floor in front of everyone. The friends who once mocked Ifunanya shifted uncomfortably, their smirks gone. The relatives who whispered behind her back lowered their eyes. The silence in the hall was heavy, and all of it pressed down on Darlington like a storm. He wanted to laugh it off, to make another cruel joke to cover the embarrassment, but no words came. His tongue was tied, his chest burning with shame. Ifunanya didn't even look at him. That was what broke him the most. She stood tall, her eyes calm, her expression serene, as though his opinion no longer mattered. And truly it didn't. The woman he thought he could control, the one he dismissed, had risen above him. He realized at that moment that he had lost her respect, And once respect is gone, love cannot survive. That night, Darlington felt something he had never known before: fear. Fear of losing control, fear of being forgotten, fear of being left behind by the very woman he had underestimated. And as the crowd's whispers grew louder, he knew the truth. Ifunanya was no longer his shadow. She had become his mirror, and in her reflection, he saw the smallness of his own pride. That night, when the event was over and the mansion grew quiet, Ifunanya stood in her room staring at the walls that once felt like home but now felt like a cage. The chandelier above glittered, the silk curtains swayed softly, and yet everything around her felt empty. She opened her closet and began folding her clothes into a suitcase. Her hands were steady, her heart surprisingly calm. For years she had cried in this room. For years she had begged silently for love and respect. But tonight she felt no tears. Tonight she felt freedom. As she packed, memories flashed. Darlington's laughter at her pain, his relatives' insults, the loneliness of nights spent in silence. But instead of breaking her, those memories strengthened her resolve. She was no longer the woman who stayed and endured. She was the woman who had found her worth, the woman who had learned that respect was not something to beg for but something to claim. When she lifted her suitcase and walked through the wide halls of the mansion, her heels clicked against the marble floor, each step sounding louder than the last. It was not the sound of departure, it was the sound of dignity. The guards by the gate looked at her with surprise, but no one stopped her. How could they? She was no longer Madame Darlington. She was Ifunanya, a woman who had chosen herself over humiliation. For the first time in years she stepped outside without fear. The night air touched her skin, cool and fresh, carrying with it a sense of rebirth. She breathed deeply, her heart light. Behind her was a life of pretense and pain. Ahead of her was the unknown. But it was hers, and that was enough. She did not look back at the mansion. She didn't need to. That chapter was closed. Ifunanya walked away not as a broken wife, but as a free woman whose story was only just beginning. And with every step, she knew she had reclaimed something priceless: her dignity. News of Ifunanya's walk away spread faster than the morning harmattan winds across Oboli. In the markets where women sold yams and pepper, her name slipped into conversations like a song. "Did you hear?" one trader whispered, her eyes wide with admiration. "She left him, and she owns part of his company." The women nodded, some smiling with pride, others shaking their heads in disbelief. They whispered her name like a blessing, like a prayer of strength. For them, she was no longer just another wife in a rich man's mansion. She was proof that dignity could rise from shame. Men, on the other hand, spoke differently. In bars and under the shade of palm trees, they lowered their voices when her name came up. Some laughed nervously, saying, "Ah, these women of today. They are not to be underestimated." Others shook their heads, warning, "Ifunanya is not a woman to joke with. She carried power silently until it spoke for her." There was caution in their tone, a reminder that respect should never be denied to a woman, no matter her beginnings. Everywhere she went, heads turned, not out of mockery this time but out of respect. The same people who once called her a gold digger now admired the way she carried herself, calm, steady, and untouched by their past cruelty. She had taken the very humiliation they threw at her and turned it into her crown. In churches, pastors used her story as an example of patience and destiny. In schools, young girls whispered about wanting to be like her, strong, graceful, and unafraid to walk away from anything that dimmed their light. Oboli had never seen a tale like hers. It was not just gossip, it was a movement, a ripple that spread from one household to another. Ifunanya had done what many thought impossible. She had turned pain into power, and the whole city watched as her story became larger than her name. She was no longer a woman mocked, she was a symbol. When Ifunanya walked into the company's boardroom after everything had unfolded, the atmosphere was different. No one saw her as Darlington's wife anymore. The same men who once laughed behind her back now rose to greet her, offering handshakes filled with respect. They had seen her strength in public, and they knew she was not a woman to overlook. With her shares and influence, she held real power, and power in silence was more commanding than any loud voice. At first, some board members hesitated, unsure if she truly belonged at that table. But the more she spoke, the clearer it became. She was not just sitting there as decoration. She asked questions they had ignored, pointed out opportunities they had missed, and suggested ideas that made them pause and nod in agreement. Slowly, their doubt turned into admiration. They began to see her not as an outsider but as a visionary, someone who could guide the company into a stronger future. She carried herself with grace, wearing her traditional ankara and iziagu with pride, each outfit telling its own story of heritage and dignity. Even in those polished rooms filled with suits and ties, her style stood out like a statement. She would never trade her roots for approval. The more she spoke, the more they realized that she was not there to be a shadow of anyone. She was building her own light. Soon she became a force in the company. Decisions that once ignored her voice now needed her input. Policies shifted under her influence, and employees whispered about her fairness and vision. She wasn't just protecting her father's legacy, she was creating her own. For the first time, Ifunanya felt free, not just from Darlington's shadow but from every label they had thrown at her. She was no longer the gold digger or the poor girl who married up. She was the queen of her own making, shaping her empire with wisdom and courage. And in that boardroom filled with men who once doubted her, she stood unshaken, a woman who turned. Everywhere people went, Ifunanya's story was on their lips. From the busy markets of Oboli to the quiet villages nearby, women whispered her name with admiration. They remembered how she had been mocked, laughed at, and called a gold digger by the very people who were supposed to welcome her. They remembered how her husband stood by and let them humiliate her. But what they could not forget most of all was how she walked away. Not broken, not defeated, but stronger than anyone expected. Men spoke of her with a mix of caution and respect. They said, "Be careful how you treat a woman. You never know who she truly is." For them, Ifunanya's story was a warning that arrogance and pride could destroy even the wealthiest man when he failed to value his wife. On social gatherings and over evening firesides, her tale spread like a song. People said she did not just leave with her dignity intact, she left with power in her hands. She had become part owner of the very empire they thought she was chasing. In the end, she didn't need Darlington's name to shine. She had her own. Ifunanya's name became more than a story. It became a lesson of patience, of quiet strength, of destiny that cannot be mocked. She proved to the world that silence does not mean weakness, and walking away can sometimes be the greatest victory. Hers was not a fall. It was a rise, and her name lived on like a crown.